You think you can just waltz in here and drive off in something like this?" The officer's voice was a low growl, laced with a casual contempt that was more insulting than any shout. His hand, thick-fingered and confident, rested on the hard black plastic of his holster. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of hierarchy. The dealership showroom lights, cold and unforgiving, gleamed off the polished concrete floor, making the exotic cars look like captured beasts in a sterile zoo. A handful of salespeople in matching blue blazers pretended not to watch. A family that had been looking at a minivan a moment before was now frozen, their feigned interest in fuel efficiency forgotten. Their phones were starting to rise, cautious, silent periscopes breaking the surface of the tension. The officer stood too close, a deliberate invasion of space, a physical assertion of power meant to diminish and intimidate. The air smelled of expensive leather and cheap adrenaline. The man, older, with graying temples and a face etched with the kind of lines that come from discipline rather than worry, did not flinch. He wore a simple but perfectly pressed button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. He simply met the officer's gaze, his posture as unshaken as the granite columns outside the building. In his open palm, he held a small black key fob. The Lamborghini crest on it was a tiny golden shield. He did not move. He did not speak. He just stood his ground, a calm island in a sea of manufactured authority. What the officer didn't know, what the smirking salesman hiding behind him didn't know, was that the man holding the key wasn't just a customer. He wasn't just a target for their suspicion. He was the reason this dealership and a dozen others like it even existed. And the quiet, methodical reckoning he was about to unleash would be remembered for a very long time. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The day had begun with light. Not the harsh fluorescent glare of the showroom, but the soft, forgiving gold of a 7 a.m. sunrise filtering through the large kitchen window. It was Marcus Thorne's favorite time of day, the quiet before the world woke up and started making its demands. He stood at the counter, the rich, dark aroma of freshly ground coffee beans filling the air. It was a ritual, the precise measurement of the beans, the low hum of the grinder, the slow pour of hot water over the grounds. Each step was a small meditation. His wife, Elena, entered the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Good morning, Colonel," she murmured into his shirt. He smiled, placing his hand over hers. "Morning, civilian." He had been retired for 3 years, but the title still clung to him, a comfortable second skin. 40 years in the Army, from a scared private to a full-bird colonel in logistics, had shaped him in ways that were impossible to shed. It had taught him patience, strategy, and the profound difference between power and authority. "What's on the great man's agenda today?" Elena asked, her voice still warm with sleep. "I have a meeting with the Port Authority Group at noon," he said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "But before that, I think I'm going to do something frivolous." She raised an eyebrow, taking the cup he offered. "Frivolous? Marcus Thorne? The man who budgets our vacation down to the last penny?" He took a sip of his coffee, the heat a welcome sensation. "I'm 65 years old, Elena. I spent 4 decades serving this country. I've built a second career that's more successful than I ever imagined. Our kids are grown and happy. I think I've earned one frivolous thing." "All right," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "What is it? A new set of golf clubs? A ridiculously expensive bottle of scotch?" "A car," he said, looking out the window at the quiet, tree-lined street of the neighborhood they had lived in for 20 years. "The one I promised myself when I was a 19-year-old kid, turning wrenches on a busted Jeep in the middle of nowhere, dreaming of something better." Elena knew which one he meant, the poster that had been taped to the inside of his footlocker for years. The dream he rarely spoke of, but that she knew lived in a small, protected corner of his heart. "The green one?" she asked softly. "The Verde Selvins one," he corrected with a gentle smile. "A Lamborghini Huracan Evo." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the quiet joy, the fulfillment of a promise made by a young man to his future self. "Well then," she said, her smile widening, "you'd better go get it." An hour later, Marcus was preparing to leave. He stood before the antique valet stand in their bedroom, a piece of dark cherry wood that had belonged to his father. On it sat a small polished box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was his father's watch. A simple 1950s timepiece with a worn leather strap. It wasn't valuable, not in the way the world measured value, but it was priceless. His father, a man who had worked 2 jobs his entire life to give Marcus a foundation to build on, had given it to him when he enlisted. "Don't ever forget what time it is," he had said, "and don't ever let anyone waste yours." Marcus strapped the watch to his wrist. The leather was soft against his skin. It was his second ritual. The coffee grounded him in the present. The watch connected him to his past. He checked himself in the mirror. His slacks were crisp, his shirt immaculate. He wasn't dressing to impress anyone. He was dressing to honor himself. He had learned a long time ago that dignity was a uniform you wore on the inside, but it didn't hurt to have the outside match. He kissed Elena goodbye, the faint scent of her perfume a comforting presence. "I'll be back in a few hours," he said. "Take your time," she replied. "Enjoy the moment." The drive to the Northgate luxury auto dealership took him across the city. He drove his perfectly maintained 10-year-old sedan, the engine humming contentedly. He wasn't a flashy man. Everything he owned was quality, chosen for function and longevity, not for show. This car, this Lamborghini, was different. It wasn't about transportation. It was a symbol, a trophy from a war fought on 1,000 different fronts, in boardrooms, on military bases, in quiet moments of enduring prejudice with unshakable grace. It was the period at the end of a long and complicated sentence. The dealership rose from the manicured landscape of the city's wealthiest suburb like a glass temple. Steel beams and enormous panes of glass showcased the machines within. Porsches, Ferraris, Aston Martins, and in the center of the showroom, under a dedicated spotlight, a Lamborghini Huracan Evo. It was the exact shade of electric green he had imagined, Verde Selvins. It looked like it was moving even while standing still. He parked his modest sedan in the lot, deliberately choosing a spot far from the entrance. He felt a flicker of that 19-year-old kid's awe. He took a breath, smoothed the front of his shirt, and walked toward the glass doors. The quiet before the storm. He didn't know it, but he had exactly 9 minutes of peace remaining. 9 minutes before the well-ordered world he had built for himself was turned upside down. The automatic doors hissed open, and he stepped inside. The air inside Northgate Luxury Auto was cool and still, carrying the faint, sterile scent of glass cleaner and the rich, intoxicating aroma of Italian leather. It was a cathedral of commerce, hushed and reverent. A young woman at a sleek, minimalist reception desk looked up from her screen, her smile practiced and immediate. "So good morning, sir. Welcome to Northgate. Is there anything I can help you with today?" "Good morning," Marcus replied, his voice calm and pleasant. "I'm here to see the Huracan Evo. I believe you have one in Verde Selvins." "We do," she said, her eyes flicking for a moment toward the magnificent green machine in the center of the room. "It's a beautiful car. Do you have an appointment with one of our brand ambassadors?" "I do not," Marcus said. "I've done my research and handled the financing pre-approval. I'm here to finalize the purchase, assuming the vehicle meets my expectations." The receptionist's professionalism was a smooth, polished veneer. "Of course, sir. Let me find someone to assist you." She spoke into a small headset, her voice a low murmur. "Chad, I have a walk-in for the Lamborghini." A moment later, a young man emerged from a glass-walled office at the back of the showroom. That was the first thing Marcus noticed. The walk. It wasn't a walk, it was a swagger. He was maybe 25, with hair that was aggressively gelled and a suit that was a size too tight in the shoulders, trying too hard to look expensive. A thin, self-satisfied smirk seemed to be a permanent feature of his face. This was Chad Miller. "Can I help you?" Chad asked, his tone implying the question was purely rhetorical. He didn't make eye contact with Marcus, his gaze sweeping over him from shoes to shirt in a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Yes," Marcus said, extending a hand. "Marcus Thorne. I'm here to purchase the Huracan." Chad ignored the offered hand, his smirk tightening. "Right. The Lambo." He rocked back on his heels. "Quite a machine. You sure you're in the right place, pal? The pre-owned sedans are on the other side of the lot." The insult was so casual, so reflexive, it was almost elegant in its crudeness. Marcus let his hand drop slowly to his side. He had felt this before. This casual erasure. He had learned a long time ago that engaging with it on its own terms was a losing battle. You couldn't win a fight with the pig, you both got dirty, and the pig liked it. Instead, you changed the battlefield. I am quite sure, Marcus said, his voice remaining level, betraying no hint of the cold knot forming in his stomach. I have a pre-approval letter from my bank for the full sticker price. Right, Chad said, waving a dismissive hand. Everyone's got a letter. Look, these have a pretty steep price tag. We don't just let people take them for joyrides. It's an insurance thing, you understand. He began to steer Marcus physically, a light but firm hand on his elbow, toward a display of more sensible vehicles. A row of certified pre-owned Audis and BMWs. Now, something like this. A8 here? This is a fantastic executive car. Great value. Marcus stopped walking, and the salesman's hand fell away. He stood his ground, not with aggression, but with an immovable sense of presence. I'm not interested in an A8, son. I'm interested in the Huracan, the green one. As I said, I'm not here for a test drive. I'm here to buy it. Chad's condescension curdled into visible annoyance. The smirk faltered. This wasn't going according to his script. Okay, look, before we even talk about popping the hood on that thing, I'm going to need to see some serious documentation. Proof of funds. Not just some letter. Marcus had anticipated this. Not because it was standard procedure, he knew it wasn't, but because he had lived his entire life in America. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a crisp envelope. Inside was a letter from the president of a major national bank, on heavy bond paper confirming a liquid cash position in Marcus's accounts well into the 8 figures, alongside the official pre-approval for the vehicle purchase. He handed it to Chad. Chad took the envelope, his movements grudging. He glanced at the letter for less than 3 seconds, his eyes barely scanning the text, the kind of look that wasn't meant to read, but to dismiss. Fine, he sighed, folding it carelessly and shoving it into his pocket. Wait here. I'll have to get the manager to approve even showing you the interior. He turned and walked away, his swagger more pronounced than ever, a performance for the other salespeople who were now watching with more open interest. Marcus stood alone by the green car. He ran his hand lightly over the cool painted metal of the fender. The car was a masterpiece of engineering and design. It deserved better than this. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He watched as another couple, white in their late 50s, dressed in expensive leisure wear, walked in. They were greeted effusively by another salesman. Within minutes, they were being handed the key fob to a Porsche 911 Turbo S. No demand for proof of funds. No dismissive questions. Just smiles and a hearty, "Enjoy the ride. Let us know what you think." The contrast was a physical blow, sharper and more painful than any slur. Marcus felt the anger. He felt it the way a sailor feels a shift in the wind, a deep, cold current. He let himself feel it for exactly 60 seconds. He counted them off in his head, a silent metronome of discipline. 1, 2, 3. At 60, he put it away. Anger was a fuel, but if you let it burn uncontrolled, it consumed you. It had to be refined, channeled, used with precision. He looked toward the glass-walled office where Chad had disappeared. He could see him inside, talking to an older man in a rumpled suit, the manager, Rick Jennings. Chad was animated, gesturing toward Marcus, a look of theatrical exasperation on his face. Jennings looked bored, annoyed. He seemed to be arguing with Chad, then finally threw his hands up in a gesture of weary resignation and waved him away. Another 5 minutes passed. Marcus had now been in the dealership for 21 minutes. His patience, a deep wellspring honed over decades, was not exhausted, but his time was. His father's words echoed in his mind. Don't ever let anyone waste yours. Chad finally reappeared, strolling back toward Marcus as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't holding any keys. Sorry, he said, the apology utterly insincere. Manager's tied up. It's going to be a while. Marcus looked at him. The boyish face, the smug certainty, the absolute lack of awareness. He wasn't just a salesman. He was a gatekeeper, a petty tyrant of a tiny glass-walled kingdom. That's unfortunate, Marcus said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. I have been waiting for over 20 minutes. I would like to either see the vehicle I intend to purchase, or I would like to speak to Mr. Jennings directly. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. Chad's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. It was a challenge to his authority, a refusal to play the role he had assigned. "You know what?" Chad said, taking a small step back and crossing his arms. "I'm getting a really weird vibe from you. I'm not comfortable with this situation." The words were chosen with care. Weird vibe. Not comfortable. They weren't an accusation of a crime, but they were the foundation upon which such an accusation could be built. They were the magic words that could summon a protector. "There is no situation," Marcus stated calmly. "I am a customer." "Yeah, well, I'm not so sure," Chad shot back, his voice rising slightly. He pulled out his personal cell phone. His fingers, trembling slightly, with a strange mix of fear and excitement, tapped on the screen. He turned his back to Marcus, walking a few feet away, and lifted the phone to his ear. Marcus watched him. He couldn't hear the exact words, but he didn't need to. He knew the tenor. He knew the cadence. He had seen this play run before, in different theaters, with different actors, but always the same script. The feigned threat, the call for reinforcement, the escalation designed to punish noncompliance. He felt the gears of a familiar and terrible machine beginning to turn, grinding slowly but with immense power. He took a deep, steadying breath. The air in the showroom suddenly felt thick and heavy. Within minutes, the hiss of the automatic doors was replaced by the heavy thud of boots on the polished floor. Officer Sullivan had arrived. He was in his mid-40s with a thick neck that strained against the collar of his uniform and the easy, rolling swagger of a man whose authority had rarely, if ever, been seriously questioned. His eyes, small and hard, scanned the showroom and landed immediately on Marcus, the only black man in the room. Chad, looking relieved and vindicated, pointed a trembling finger. "That's him, officer, the one I told you about." Officer Sullivan's hand went to his holster, a gesture so practiced and reflexive it seemed unconscious. He didn't unclip it, but the message was clear. It was a conversational gambit, a way of setting the terms of the encounter before a single word was spoken. He approached Marcus, completely ignoring the salespeople, the customers, and the general manager who was now hovering nervously near his office door. "We got a call about a suspicious individual causing a disturbance," Sullivan said. His voice was flat, devoid of curiosity. It was the voice of a man who had already made up his mind. "There is no disturbance, officer," Marcus said. His voice was a study in calm. He kept his hands open and visible at his sides. He had learned that lesson decades ago. Slow and deliberate. "I am a customer attempting to purchase a vehicle." "That's not what I heard," Sullivan replied, his gaze flicking over to Chad, who nodded eagerly. "I heard you were making the staff uncomfortable, refusing to cooperate." "I have been perfectly cooperative," Marcus stated. He wasn't arguing. He was correcting the record. "I provided my financial pre-approval. I have been waiting for nearly 30 minutes to see the car I wish to buy. I then requested to speak to the manager." "Let me see some ID," Sullivan commanded. It wasn't a request. Marcus complied without hesitation. He reached slowly into his back pocket and retrieved his wallet. He extracted his driver's license and, on a separate card, his retired military identification. He handed them both to the officer. Sullivan glanced at the driver's license, then his eyes lingered on the military ID. "Colonel, United States Army, retired." He let out a short, derisive puff of air. "Anyone can get one of these made online." He handed the cards back as if they were contaminated. The disrespect was a calculated jab. "What are you doing here?" Sullivan asked, leaning in closer. "Really?" "I am here," Marcus said, enunciating each word with precision, "to buy that green Lamborghini." He gestured with a slight nod of his head. Sullivan followed his gaze to the car, then back to Marcus. A slow, incredulous smirk spread across his face. It was a genuinely ugly expression, a mix of disbelief and disdain. And then he asked the question, the one that laid everything bare. "How can you afford a car like this?" The question hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was the heart of the matter. It wasn't about a disturbance. It wasn't about cooperation. It was about a worldview being violated. It was about a black man in a simple shirt standing in a place this officer believed he had no right to be, trying to buy something this officer believed he had no right to own. The other customers were now openly staring. A teenager, standing with her parents, had her phone up. Marcus could see the small red dot in the corner of her screen. She was recording. Good. Let there be a record. Let there be a witness. Marcus held the officer's gaze. My personal finances, he said, his voice dropping into an even quieter, more resolute register, are not your concern. They have been verified by my bank. The documentation is in the pocket of that salesman. He nodded toward Chad. This assertion of a boundary, this refusal to be humiliated into justifying his own existence, was more than Sullivan could tolerate. It was insubordination. He saw it as a direct challenge to the uniform. Is that right? Sullivan said, his voice hardening, and then came the line from the hook, the one that would echo in a dozen news reports. You think you can just waltz in here and drive off in something like this? I think I can purchase a product that is for sale, Marcus replied. That is the fundamental principle of commerce, is it not? That was it, the final straw. The calm, intellectual response was seen as mockery. Sullivan's face flushed a deep mottled red. All right, you're done. You're creating a public disturbance. Put your hands behind your back. Marcus stood his ground. He did not move. Officer, on what grounds am I being arrested? Failure to cooperate. Public disturbance. Take your pick. I have cooperated fully, Marcus said, and the only disturbance here is the one you and the salesman have created. Am I being detained? It was a specific legal question. You're damn right you're being detained, Sullivan snarled, his professional facade crumbling into pure street corner aggression. For what specific articulable crime? Marcus asked. The question was a scalpel. Precise, legal, unanswerable. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. He was cornered by language he didn't fully command, so he resorted to the tool he understood best. For being a pain in my ass, he muttered, then louder for the audience, for resisting. Now put your hands behind your back or I'll put you on the ground. Marcus made a calculation. He saw the fire in the officer's eyes. He saw the hands itching to escalate. He had been trained in de-escalation, but he also knew when a situation had passed that point. To resist physically would be suicide by policy. To comply was a deep and profound humiliation, but it was also a strategic retreat. It was the only move that allowed him to continue to fight on his own terms. Slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone saw the lack of aggression, he turned and placed his hands behind his back. The cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrist. The first click was loud in the suddenly silent showroom. The second click sealed it. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, a mixture of pity, fear, and for some, a grim satisfaction. His dignity was being publicly stripped from him, piece by piece. But as they led him away, his back remained ramrod straight. He was a colonel. He was the son of a man who worked 2 jobs. He would not let them see him break. The walk from the center of the showroom to the front entrance felt like a mile. Each step was a fresh wave of humiliation. The gleaming cars seemed to mock him. The faces of the salespeople were a blur of carefully constructed neutrality. Only Chad Miller's face was clear, a triumphant smirk plastered across it. He had won. He had successfully weaponized his prejudice, and the system had validated him. Officer Sullivan kept a firm, proprietary hand on Marcus's upper arm, parading him like a trophy. Marcus focused on his breathing. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. A technique he'd learned at Fort Bragg to stay calm under fire. The principle was the same. The enemy was just different. The glass doors hissed open, and the warm afternoon air was a shock after the refrigerated chill of the dealership. The sun was bright, glinting off the hood of Sullivan's patrol car. He walked Marcus to the rear passenger door and pushed his head down with unnecessary force. "Watch your head," he grunted, a parody of politeness. The back of the car was cramped and smelled of stale air freshener, disinfectant, and the faint, lingering scent of human misery. The door slammed shut with a heavy final thud. The world was now framed by a thick wire cage and dirty plexiglass. He watched as Sullivan spoke briefly with Chad, the 2 of them sharing a conspiratorial nod. Then the officer got in, the car dipped with his weight, and the engine rumbled to life. They pulled out of the lot. Marcus watched the dealership recede, the green Lamborghini a flash of brilliant color in the window before it was gone. He looked at his reflection in the plexiglass divider. A man in his 60s, in a good shirt, with his hands cuffed behind his back. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill. 40 years of service, a lifetime of careful conduct, erased in 30 minutes by a boy in a cheap suit and a man with a badge and a fragile ego. The drive to the station was silent. Sullivan turned on the radio, a talk show where people shouted at each other about politics. The noise was an irritant, another small act of dehumanization. Marcus tuned it out. He watched the city slide by, the parks where he walked with Elena, the library where he'd taken his children, the gleaming office tower where his consulting firm occupied the top 2 floors. A city he knew, a city he had served, a city that was now treating him like a criminal. He counted the blocks. He counted the traffic lights. He counted his breaths. He kept his anger in a locked box in the back of his mind. It was not time for anger. It was time for observation, for memory, for strategy. They arrived at the downtown precinct, a brutalist concrete building that seemed designed to intimidate. Sullivan led him through a side entrance into a world of beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the constant low hum of bureaucracy. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, sweat, and institutional indifference. He was taken to a booking desk where a tired-looking sergeant with a large mustache barely looked up. "What do we have here, Sully?" "Public disturbance. Resisting. Failure to cooperate." Sullivan rattled off the charges, a fictional narrative he was already starting to believe himself. "Got him trying to cause trouble over at the fancy car lot in Northgate." The sergeant grunted. He took Marcus's information in a bored monotone. Then came the inventory of his personal effects. His wallet, his keys, his belt, and his watch. "Take off the watch," the sergeant ordered. Marcus hesitated. "Sergeant, that watch was my father's. It is of great sentimental value. I ask that you please handle it with care." The sergeant looked at the simple old watch, then back at Marcus. For a moment, a flicker of something human seemed to pass through his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by practiced apathy. He dropped it into a small plastic bag with a clatter. "It all goes in the bag, pal. You'll get it back when you get it back." They took his fingerprints. The cold, sticky ink was another small degradation. He was photographed, a harsh flash momentarily blinding him. Then he was led down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing in the small concrete room. He was alone. The cell contained a single concrete bench and a toilet. The walls were covered in graffiti, the desperate scratchings of countless people who had sat where he was sitting. He looked at his hands, the wrists red and raw from the cuffs. He sat down on the cold bench, and then he let the box open, just for a moment. He let himself feel it all, the searing rage, the profound, bottomless humiliation, the injustice of it so stark and so familiar. He felt the shame of being paraded through the showroom. He felt the sting of the officer's contempt. He felt the cold weight of the concrete room seeping into his bones. He gave the feelings exactly 5 minutes. A timer in his head, precise and unwavering. He owed his own humanity that much. He let the wave crash over him. Then, at the 5-minute mark, he stood up. He walked to the small, barred window in the door. He took a deep breath. The emotional storm was over. The feelings were acknowledged, processed, and put back in their place. They were now fuel, refined, potent, ready to be used. The machine had done its work on him. Now, he would turn a different machine on them. An hour later, a guard came to his cell door. "Thorne, you get 1 phone call." The guard led him to a small, dirty alcove with a metal phone bolted to the wall. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expecting a call to a frantic wife or a sleazy bail bondsman. He was radiating an aura of bored impatience. Marcus picked up the heavy receiver. It was greasy to the touch. He ignored the grime and the smell. He ignored the guard. He closed his eyes for a moment, accessing a number he had committed to memory years ago, a number reserved for true emergencies. He punched in the digits with a steady finger. The phone rang twice. A crisp professional voice answered on the other end. "Office of Arthur Sterling." "This is Marcus Thorne for Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice even and low. "It is a personal and urgent matter." "1 moment, Mr. Thorne," the assistant said. There was a brief pause, the sound of a button being pressed. Then a new voice came on the line, a voice of immense power, accustomed to being obeyed. "Marcus, What's going on? My schedule said you were supposed to be on a golf course this afternoon, fleecing old men like me. The voice belonged to Arthur Sterling, the billionaire founder and CEO of Sterling Automotive Group, one of the largest luxury auto conglomerates in the country. Northgate Luxury Auto was just one of the dozens of dealerships he owned. He and Marcus had met 20 years prior, serving on a civilian oversight board for military procurement. They had bonded over a shared belief in integrity and a mutual dislike for bureaucratic nonsense. They had been friends ever since. Marcus allowed himself a small, grim smile. Arthur, good morning. I'm afraid I've had to postpone the golf game. He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. I'm at the downtown precinct. It seems there was some confusion about my purchase at your Northgate location. There was a silence on the other end of the line. It lasted for about 3 seconds, but in that silence, Arthur Sterling, a man who could dissect a hostile takeover bid in his sleep, understood everything. He understood the location. He understood the confusion. He understood the profound and damning subtext of his friend, a retired Army colonel, calling him from a police station after trying to buy a car from one of his own dealerships. The understated nature of the call was not a sign of calm. It was a declaration of war. When Sterling spoke again, his voice had changed. The friendly warmth was gone, replaced by a blade of cold, focused fury. Marcus, don't say another word to anyone. Which precinct exactly? The central booking facility on 12th Street, Marcus replied. I'm sending my general counsel to you right now. Her name is Jessica Ramirez. She'll be there in 15 minutes. Do not speak to anyone until she arrives. Not a guard, not a detective, not a soul. Do you understand? I understand, Arthur. I am on my way to Northgate personally, Sterling continued, his voice a low growl. We are going to dismantle this, brick by brick. Thank you, Arthur, Marcus said quietly. Your father was one of the finest men I ever knew, Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. He did not raise a son to be treated like this. I'll see you soon. The line went dead. Marcus placed the receiver back on its cradle. He turned to the guard, who was now looking at him with a new expression. Not respect, but a dawning, fearful curiosity. There had been no panic in that call, no begging, only the quiet, efficient coordination of immense power. The guard suddenly seemed to stand up a little straighter. Back to the cell, he said, his voice now noticeably less dismissive. As Marcus was led back to the cold concrete room, a different kind of storm was gathering on the outside. In his penthouse office overlooking the city, Arthur Sterling hung up the phone. His face, usually jovial, was a thunderous mask of rage. He stabbed a button on his intercom. Elizabeth, get Jessica Ramirez on my private line. Now. Seconds later, his top lawyer was on the phone. Jessica, he said, dispensing with all pleasantries. Clear your entire day. Our friend, Colonel Marcus Thorne, is being held at the 12th Street precinct. He was arrested at Northgate while trying to buy a car. Get down there. Find out the charges, find out who the arresting officer was, and get him out. Use every tool in our arsenal. I want him walking out of there in an hour. He didn't wait for a reply. He hung up and hit another button. Frank, he barked at his chief of operations, I want the complete, unedited security footage from Northgate for the last 3 hours. Every camera, interior, exterior. I want it on my tablet in 10 minutes. And I want a list of every single employee who was on the clock today. Sales, management, reception, everyone. He stood up, grabbing the jacket of his bespoke suit from the back of his chair. His movements were sharp, angry. He walked to the door of his office where his driver, a large man who had been with him for 30 years, was already waiting, having been alerted by the change in his boss's tone. Where to, Mr. Sterling? Northgate, Sterling said, his voice like gravel. And I don't care about the speed limit. The machine was now turning in the other direction, and it was much, much bigger. The black Maybach S-Class, a car that cost more than the average American house, sliced through city traffic with silent, imposing grace. It didn't so much arrive at the Northgate luxury auto dealership as it materialized, parking diagonally across 2 prime spots directly in front of the main entrance. It was a flagrant violation of parking etiquette, a deliberate and unmistakable assertion of dominance, the automotive equivalent of planting a flag on conquered territory. Arthur Sterling emerged from the back seat before the driver could even open the door. He was a man in his late 60s, but he moved with the energy of someone half his age, fueled by a righteous glacial fury. He strode toward the glass doors, which hissed open as if in deference. The atmosphere inside the showroom changed instantly. The low hum of conversation ceased. The salespeople froze. They recognized him. He was a figure of legend, the man whose name was on their paychecks, but who most had only ever seen in corporate training videos. The general manager, Rick Jennings, came scurrying out of his glass-walled office, his face pale and slick with a sudden sweat. His tie was slightly askew, and he fumbled to straighten it. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir, what a pleasant surprise. We weren't expecting you," Jennings stammered, his voice thin and reedy. Sterling stopped directly in front of him, his shadow falling over the smaller man. His voice was as cold and hard as polished granite. "Where is he, Rick?" "Who, sir? I'm sorry?" Jennings asked, genuinely confused. "The salesman," Sterling clarified, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "The one who called the police on a decorated Army colonel an hour ago. The one who had my friend arrested for trying to give us his business. Where is he?" Jennings' face went from pale to chalk white. The blood drained from it. Oh God. Chad. You mean Chad." He turned and frantically gestured toward the sales floor. "Chad, Mr. Sterling wants to see you." Chad Miller emerged from behind a row of sedans where he had been boasting to a colleague. He swaggered forward, that familiar, odious smirk fixed on his face, clearly assuming this was about a big sale. The smirk evaporated the moment he saw the look on Arthur Sterling's face. It was an expression of such pure, undiluted contempt that it felt like a physical force. Sterling looked Chad up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal that stripped away the cheap suit and the gelled hair, leaving only the petty, frightened man underneath. "Tell me what happened," Sterling commanded. It was not a request for a conversation. It was a demand for a final statement. Chad, now visibly trembling, launched into a desperate, self-serving version of events. "Sir, this guy, he came in. He was acting really suspicious, you know? He wouldn't answer my questions. He was being aggressive, and I felt threatened. For the safety of the dealership, I thought it was best to call for assistance." Sterling listened to the stream of lies without blinking. His face was impassive, but his eyes were like chips of ice. As Chad's pathetic story wound down, a new figure stepped forward. It was a young salesman named David, a kid who had only been on the job for 6 months. He was terrified, his hands shaking, but there was a look of grim determination in his eyes. "Sir, Mr. Sterling," David said, his voice barely a whisper but cutting through the silence. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's not what happened." Sterling turned his full attention to the young man. "Go on," he said, his voice softer now, encouraging. And David told the truth. He spoke of how Colonel Thorne had been polite and direct. He mentioned the financial documentation that Chad had dismissed without reading. He described how Chad had tried to steer him to cheaper cars, the condescending tone, the deliberate delays. He recounted the stark difference in treatment given to the white couple who wanted to test drive the Porsche. He told the whole ugly story, his voice gaining strength as he went on. While David spoke, Sterling had pulled out his tablet. His chief of operations had delivered. He was watching the security footage. No audio, but the visuals were damning. It showed Marcus's calm, patient posture. It showed Chad's dismissive gestures. It showed the Porsche keys being handed over with a smile. It showed Marcus's polite but firm stance and Chad's angry reaction. It showed everything. When David finished, Sterling looked at the recording, then at Chad, and then he turned his gaze upon Rick Jennings. "You were aware of this?" Jennings began to sputter. Well, Chad mentioned he was uncomfortable. "I told him to handle it. I didn't know he was going to call the police, I swear." "You are the manager of this store, Rick," Sterling said, his voice ablaze. "It is your job to know. It is your job to lead. Instead, you allowed an employee to call the police on a customer, on my friend, because your salesman is a prejudiced little coward who couldn't fathom a black man buying a supercar. You did not lead. You hid." He turned back to Chad, who now looked like he was about to be physically ill. "You're fired," Sterling said, the words simple and final. "Your employment with Sterling Automotive Group is terminated, effective immediately. Pack your personal belongings. Security will escort you from the property. If you ever set foot in one of my dealerships again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Then he faced Jennings again. You, my corporate office, Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. You and I and the entire board are going to have a very long conversation about your future. I suggest you spend the weekend thinking about whether you even have one with this company. As a stunned and weeping Chad was led away by security, another pair approached. It was the teenager Maya and her father. The man was holding his phone. "Sir," he said to Sterling, "excuse me. My daughter, she recorded the whole thing, with audio." Sterling turned to them. He looked at the young woman's determined face. "May I see it?" he asked gently. The father handed him the phone. Sterling pressed play, and for the first time, he heard it. He heard Marcus's calm, precise words. He heard Chad's insolence, and he heard Officer Sullivan's voice, dripping with contempt. "How can you afford a car like this?" The question made Sterling's blood run cold. He watched the whole video, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. "Thank you," he said, handing the phone back. "You have performed a great service today, for my friend and for this community. Would you be willing to send a copy of that file to my legal department?" "We'd be honored," the father said. Sterling nodded, a look of profound gratitude on his face. He had the truth. He had the video. He had the witnesses. The reckoning at the dealership was complete. Now it was time for the precinct. The 12th Street precinct was buzzing with the low-grade chaos of a late afternoon shift change when Jessica Ramirez arrived. She was a force of nature in a perfectly tailored suit, her briefcase holding more legal firepower than the precinct's entire armory. She didn't walk, she strode. Her reputation preceded her. When she announced she was there as legal counsel for Arthur Sterling, doors that were normally closed magically opened. She had already spoken to the desk sergeant, a man who had suddenly become incredibly helpful, and was now demanding to see the precinct captain. The captain, a political animal named O'Malley who knew exactly who Arthur Sterling was and the kind of influence he wielded, was in damage control mode. He met her in his office, his face a mask of professional concern. "Ms. Ramirez, thank you for coming down. We're still processing the situation." "Let's dispense with the processing, Captain," Jessica said, setting her briefcase on his desk with a firm click. "My client's friend, Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man who has served this country with distinction for 40 years, was arrested in a private business today for, as far as I can tell, the crime of being a successful black man. I want to see the arresting officer's incident report. Now." O'Malley hesitated, but one look at her face told him that resistance was futile. He had a subordinate bring the report. It was exactly the fiction Jessica had expected. Subject was agitated and hostile, refused to provide identification, created a public disturbance, causing alarm, resisted arrest. It was a paint-by-numbers justification for a bad arrest. Just as Jessica was about to dismantle the report line by line, Arthur Sterling walked into the office. He hadn't bothered to be announced. The captain stood up reflexively. "Captain O'Malley," Sterling said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My friend, Colonel Marcus Thorne, is in one of your cells. I want him released. I want his record expunged, and I want the officer who did this held accountable. And I want it all to happen in the next 30 minutes. "Mr. Sterling, we have procedures," O'Malley began. "Your procedures just failed catastrophically," Sterling cut him off. He gestured to Jessica. "Show him." Jessica placed her tablet on the captain's desk and played Maya's video. The audio was crystal clear in the quiet office. They watched Marcus's unshakable calm. They heard Chad's smarmy provocations. They saw Officer Sullivan's escalating aggression, his hand on his holster, his invasion of personal space. And they heard the damning question, "How can you afford a car like this?" They watched as Marcus calmly asked on what grounds he was being detained and saw Sullivan's angry, inadequate response before cuffing him. The color drained from Captain O'Malley's face. This wasn't a he said situation. This was a clear-cut, video-documented case of profiling, abuse of power, and false arrest. This was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit waiting to happen. This was a media firestorm that would engulf his department. This was, above all, a profound injustice. He looked at the falsified report on his desk, then at the undeniable truth on the screen. He made the only calculation he could. He had to cut the cancer out. "Get Officer Sullivan in here," he ordered into his desk phone. A few minutes later, Officer Sullivan swaggered in, a look of smug satisfaction still on his face. The look faltered when he saw Arthur Sterling and a high-powered lawyer sitting across from his captain. His internal alarms, long dormant, began to sound. "Sullivan," O'Malley said, his voice cold, "recount the events of the arrest at the Northgate dealership." Sullivan, now sweating, repeated the lies from his report, his voice less confident with every word. He could feel the atmosphere in the room turning against him. When he finished, O'Malley simply pointed to the tablet. "Then explain this video." Sullivan stared at the screen, his own image playing back at him, his own voice condemning him. His face went through a rapid series of transformations. Confusion, denial, panic, and finally a sullen, defeated rage. He had no explanation. The video was the truth. His report was a lie. He was caught. Captain O'Malley stood up. His career was flashing before his eyes, and his survival instinct was screaming at him to jettison the liability. "Officer Sullivan," he said, his voice ringing with official finality, "pursuant to departmental regulations, you are hereby suspended without pay, pending a full internal affairs investigation. Hand over your badge and your service weapon." Sullivan stared at him, dumbfounded. "Captain, you can't be serious. I was doing my job." "No," O'Malley countered, his voice like ice. "You are abusing your authority, and you embarrassed this entire department. Now, your badge and weapon." Two stone-faced internal affairs officers who had been waiting outside the office entered the room. The irony was thick enough to taste. The man who had put Marcus Thorne in handcuffs was now being disarmed and stripped of his authority. They escorted a stunned, sputtering Sullivan from the room. He would be processed out, his gun and shield taken and inventoried, just as he had done to countless others. The machine, once his shield, had turned on him. O'Malley then had Marcus brought from the holding cell into his office. Marcus walked in, his composure still intact, but his eyes were weary. The captain stood and faced him. The bluster was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine shame. "Colonel Thorne," he said, his voice heavy, "on behalf of the city and this police department, I offer you my most profound and sincere apology. There is no excuse for what happened to you today. All charges are being dropped, effective immediately. This arrest will be fully and permanently expunged from your record. It will be as if it never happened." Marcus simply looked at him and gave a single, slow nod. An apology was a start, but he knew, and everyone in the room knew, that it could not erase the humiliation. It could not give him back the hours he had lost. It could not undo the feeling of cold steel on his wrists. His personal effects were brought to him. The desk sergeant who had carelessly dropped his father's watch into a plastic bag now handled it as if it were a holy relic, placing it carefully in Marcus's palm. Marcus strapped the watch back on his wrist. The familiar weight was grounding. It was time to go home. Marcus walked out of the precinct's heavy front doors and into the late afternoon sunlight. The air felt fresh, clean. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. He was free. Arthur Sterling was waiting for him by the Maybach, the driver holding the rear door open. "I'll have my driver take you home, Marcus," Sterling said quietly. "Thank you, Arthur," Marcus replied, his voice thick with an emotion he wouldn't allow himself to show. "For everything." Sterling put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "He was a good man, your father," he said. A reference to a long-ago time when Marcus's dad, a master mechanic, had helped a young, struggling Arthur Sterling keep his first clunker of a delivery truck running. "He would be immensely proud of the man you are." The two men shared a look of deep, unspoken understanding. Marcus got into the car, sinking into the plush leather seat. The door closed, shutting out the sounds of the city, creating a cocoon of silence. The drive home was quiet. Marcus didn't speak. He just looked out the window, watching the familiar streets go by. He was processing the day's events, not with anger, but with a kind of weary resignation. He had faced the machine, and with the help of a powerful friend, he had won. But he was acutely aware of all the people who faced that same machine alone, without a billionaire on speed dial. The victory felt personal, but the problem felt immense. The Maybach pulled onto his quiet, tree-lined street and glided to a stop in front of his house. Eleanor was waiting on the porch. She must have gotten a call from Arthur's office. She didn't rush toward the car. She just stood there, her presence a beacon of calm and love. Marcus got out. He walked up the stone path to his front door. Eleanor didn't say a word. She just opened her arms, and he stepped into her embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, and for the first time that day, the rigid, iron-willed discipline of the colonel gave way. The armor finally came off. He wasn't a soldier or a CEO or a victim. He was just a man, home with his wife. He let the full weight of the day settle on him, and she held him, her quiet strength absorbing it all. Later, they sat at their kitchen table. The house was filled with the comforting aroma of her cooking. Beef stew, his favorite, a meal that symbolized home, safety, normalcy. With the warm bowl in front of him and Elena's hand covering his on the table, he told her everything. He recounted every dismissive glance, every insulting word, every click of the handcuffs. He spoke without anger, his voice a low, steady monotone. He was documenting it for her, for himself. She listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his. Her presence was his anchor in the storm. When he finished, she simply squeezed his hand. "I'm so sorry you went through that, Marcus," she said softly, "but I have never been more proud of you." In her eyes he saw not pity, but a profound and unwavering respect for his strength, his dignity. That was all he needed. The next day, the story broke, but on their terms. Sterling Automotive Group issued a comprehensive press release. It didn't hedge or obfuscate. It was a masterclass in corporate accountability. It named Colonel Marcus Thorne, detailing his distinguished service. It offered a full, unreserved public apology for the abhorrent and discriminatory treatment he had received. It announced the immediate termination of the salesman, Chad Miller, and the suspension of the manager, Rick Jennings, pending a full review. But it went further. Sterling announced a new, mandatory, company-wide anti-bias and cultural sensitivity training program to be designed and implemented by a renowned third-party expert in the field. He also announced the Sterling Promise Initiative, a multi-million-dollar fund to create partnerships with youth mentorship programs in underserved communities across the city, aimed at creating pathways to careers in the automotive industry. The press release ended with a personal quote from Arthur Sterling. "An injustice to one is a threat to all. We failed Colonel Thorne, and we failed our community. We will do better. The work starts today." The news cycle was swift and decisive. The dealership was cast as the villain, but Sterling Automotive was praised for its swift, transparent, and comprehensive response. The police department, facing a PR nightmare, announced that Officer Sullivan's suspension was indefinite and that the U.S. Department of Justice had been invited to review their training and patrol practices. The machine wasn't just being tweaked, it was being overhauled. A few days passed. The media attention began to fade, replaced by the next outrage, the next story. For Marcus, life began to return to a semblance of normal. He had 21 days of his old consulting contract's leave remaining, a relic of a life before this incident, but this was a new chapter. He spent the time with Elena, taking long walks, having quiet dinners, healing. Then he got a call from Arthur Sterling. "Your car is ready, Colonel," his friend said, his voice warm. Marcus drove his old sedan back to the Northgate dealership. The atmosphere was entirely different. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a subdued, almost somber professionalism. The interim manager, a woman brought in from another of Sterling's top-performing stores, greeted him at the door with quiet respect. "Colonel Thorne, welcome. We're honored to have you back." In the center of the showroom, the Verde Selvin's Lamborghini waited. It was even more beautiful than he remembered. Polished to a mirror shine, it seemed to hum with latent power. Arthur Sterling was standing beside it, a small smile on his face. "She's all yours, Marcus," Sterling said, holding out the key fob. "And of course, this one is on the house." A small gesture of apology from the company. Marcus looked at the keys, then at his friend. He shook his head slowly. "No, Arthur," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I appreciate the gesture more than you know, but I will pay for my car." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. It was for the full sticker price, down to the penny. "It's a matter of dignity," Marcus explained. "I earned this. I am not a charity case. I am a customer." Sterling looked at the check, then at Marcus's resolute face. He understood completely. This wasn't about money. It was about closing the circle on his own terms. It was about finishing the transaction that had been so violently interrupted. Taking the car for free would have tainted the victory, turning it into a settlement. Paying for it made it a triumph. Sterling nodded slowly and took the check. Of course, Marcus, you're right. Marcus took the key fob. He walked around the car one last time, running his hand over its flank. He got in, the door scissoring up with a futuristic hiss. The cockpit fit around him like a glove. The smell was of new leather and limitless potential. He put his hands on the steering wheel. He pressed the ignition button, protected by a red fighter jet style flip cover. The V10 engine behind his head roared to life, a deep, guttural masterpiece of sound that vibrated through his entire body. He put the car in gear. He pulled out of the dealership, not fast, not with a screech of tires, but with a deliberate, confident power. He nodded to Arthur as he passed. He drove through the manicured streets of Northgate, a flash of impossible green against the beige landscape. The final scene found him on a long, open highway, heading west out of the city as the sun began its slow descent. The top was down. The wind, cool and clean, whipped through the cabin, a welcome baptism. He wasn't smiling, not in a conventional way. His expression was one of deep, reflective peace. He had faced the machine. He had been chewed up by its gears, but he had not been broken. He had endured, he had strategized, and he had won. Not just for himself, but for the principle of the thing. It was never about the car. It was about the right to want it, the right to earn it, and the right to buy it without being questioned, suspected, or humiliated. It was about the freedom to simply be. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of black asphalt unwinding toward the horizon. The sky was a blaze of orange and purple. He pressed down on the accelerator just a little. The engine responded with a joyous howl, pushing him back into his seat. It was just him, the road, the engine, and the wide-open evening air. He was driving toward the sunset, a free man in every sense of the word. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.